And I think that's why Mark really rocked my world. And I was like, oh no! Or like being like, oh my gosh, what is this word? How do I wrestle with this? It's challenging. It's still challenging. The immediacy in Mark is another thing.
Great theme, yeah.
Like,
there's this word euthus in Greek, and it means immediately. And it's happening, the euthus happens, I don't know how many times, but it's all over the place.
Yeah.
Where
he just goes from one thing to another, to another, to another, to another. The man gets no rest.
Yeah.
He just goes. All of Mark, if you did a timeline, could take place in 30 days.
Yeah.
Like, that's how, like, they winnowed down the 3 years of ministry and makes it fast-paced. There's an urgency that's really driving the gospel, and I don't really know what to do with that, like, what to make of it. See, I'm still wrestling with it.
Yeah.
So it's so interesting, and for me, it's immediately engaging.
Yeah.
It's about the here, it's about the now. There's no backstory in Mark, whereas in like all the other gospels, you get some backstory, behind the scenes stuff, some family language, things like that.
It's luxuriously told.
Yes.
In Matthew and Luke, and certainly in John.
And
Mark, we're getting to it.
Yeah, and it's an aggressive gospel.
Yeah. Well,
I like it. See, I just get it. Like,
yeah.
I tense up when I talk about Mark because that's the feeling of
There's
Mark.
energy. There's energy in Mark.
Yeah.
Let's jump to the first story. I want you to look at Mark 5, and one of the what I'd say about this is scholars for a long time have not liked Mark.
Yeah.
Poor Mark. Mark was always considered the derivative, stripped down version of Matthew, which the church always has loved Matthew. That was the church's gospel.
Yeah. Which is weird.
Well, up until now, Matthew is the first gospel to use the word church, ecclesia. Well, maybe that's why, I don't know. But it's a full story, big story. But now, in the last century, and then certainly in the last 40 years, Mark has gotten almost all of the attention. Because we realize it's the first gospel, and part of the reason we argue that is if you are telling someone's story and you're trying to remember, do you remember these long, florid things somebody says, or short, pithy, memorable statements?
Pithy.
You always go short and pithy. So just in oral tradition, Mark fits what we look at, for a logion or a sayings kind of gospel model. But what people used to say is that, well, it's the earliest, and so it's kind of crass.
Yeah.
The language is not elegant, especially compared to classical Greek. And so they didn't really value Mark literarily very highly, and that's really changed today.
Yeah.
Because we've realized that Mark tells this story in an incredibly intellectual and in a way with great literary merit. In a way that we only appreciate kind of recently. One of the great examples is in Mark 5, and Mark uses a technique called intercalation. When you intercalate a story, you tell a little bit of one story, then you insert a new story, and then you finish up with that other story, and then that other one as well. And so it's this kind of sandwiching.
It's a weaving.
It's a weaving in, and what that does, this is brilliant, is it allows the reader hearing these two stories to judge for themselves and make comparisons and contrasts all by themselves. It's not an author who's telling you, here's how you interpret this story. I'm just going to set these next to each other in this way, woven in together, and allow you to kind of be changed by this experience.
We do that in preaching a lot.
Well, I practice Markan intercalation almost every week. So the two stories you get in Mark are amazing here in chapter 5. You've got Jesus hanging out, and Jairus, the synagogue leader, comes and runs to him. Now Jairus is going to be at the high end of the social hierarchy. Yeah. He's male. He's a synagogue leader. He goes down to Jesus and he says, "My daughter is sick unto death. If you but lay your hands on her, I know that she will be healed. And Jesus says, okay, I'll go. So as he's going on the way, immediately, I'm sure, then he's passing through a crowd, and a woman who's been sick for 14 years with a hemorrhage. So she's a woman. You got the man up here who's the synagogue leader. The woman down here, who's by blood, she's unclean ritually in the community.
Because of her hemorrhage.
Because of this hemorrhage. And so she should not have contact with anybody, because to touch anyone when you're unclean makes them unclean too. She is so desperate for healing that when she sees Jesus, she thinks, oh, if I just touch the hem of his robe. And she does. She squeezes in and she grabs hold of his robe and she is healed. Jesus feels, as Mark says, the power leave him. Says, who did that? Who did that? And she fesses up. And he says, your faith has made you well. So this low on the totem pole person who's unclean, Jesus encounters her. Then he makes it to Jairus. Again, we go back up. And his daughter is indeed dead by the time he finally gets there. But he tells everybody, stop wailing. She's really alive, and says, Talitha Kumi, and takes her by the hand, and she sits up. What Mark does by weaving together these two stories is he shows us in an instant Jesus is someone who's not just for the people you would expect.
Yeah.
It's not just for the powerful, wealthy, and insiders, but it's for the woman too, who is an outsider, who's poor, who's homeless, no doubt, and is at the very margin, the very edge of society. This is a Jesus who goes from one to the other like that. That's jarring to us.
Yeah. I see Mark represented in circles a lot of times, with inside, outside.
Yes.
And so with Jairus, you have someone who's at the middle of that, who's at the epicenter of the circle.
Yeah.
And you have the woman who's
at the very edge, if not outside.
Outside of the circle, and all the rungs in between, and that Jesus just bounces back and forth between them.
All the rungs that we set up. Right? All the hierarchies, and even in...
He crashes.
He just crashes through them.
And crashes back and forth.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. So let's go on to our next story. Mark 8. And this is a classic. Stupid disciples. The disciples who, again using that circle, are in the middle.
Yes,
they're with him.
Center.
They see him, and they see him do these things. They listen to his words, and no doubt discuss them, And they do not understand. They just don't understand who Jesus is. And so Jesus is talking with them, and he asks, "Who do people say I am?" I always feel bad for the disciples because Jesus asked